Working on well-being. How should we define and measure poverty? Defining and measuring poverty in the United States and all over the world is a complex and multifaceted issue. You must account for measurable indicators of well-being, such as income and benefits received by the government, as well as necessary expenses like food, childcare, and medical care. However, measuring poverty becomes more complicated when taking into account less easily measured aspects of well-being, like social inclusion, job opportunities, and the environmental circumstances that allow people to live a decent life. Poverty should be defined as a state of being unable to afford the components that make up a decent life, including basic necessities like shelter, food and water, and sufficient access to education, job opportunities, and healthcare.
We believe poverty should be measured primarily monetarily, looking at a household's income but subtracting non-discretionary expenses such as taxes, adding in non-cash government benefits, and taking into account the effects of geographical differences, access to education, social inclusion, and employment opportunities.
These ideas are primarily a combination of ideas present in the supplemental poverty measure and the capabilities approach. We believe that while they may be easier to track globally, the official poverty measure, relative poverty measure, and the extreme poverty measure fall short of accurately measuring poverty and taking into account people's well-being and dignity.
There are many good aspects of the SPM, one of which is that it subtracts non-discretionary expenses and adds non-cash government benefits when looking at income. This is important because it is looking at the most accurate income of a family, recognizing that taxes and unavoidable expenses such as medical expenses greatly affect a household, but also that the government's anti-poverty programs are already helping those who do not have the finances to pay for necessities.
For example, in 2021, the child poverty rate went down 46% from the previous year, according to the SPM, while the OPM did not have the same data. This is because the government focuses a lot of their benefits on children and childcare, like SNAP and the child tax credit, and the SPM took these benefits into account. The measure was a lot more accurate in comparison to the OPM for people in poverty under the age of 18.
The SPM is also adjusted based on where someone is living, acknowledging that different areas have different costs of living and therefore are going to require different amounts of income. It updates the definition of a household, including foster children and people that are unrelated but living together, as part of the family. These are situations that are not uncommon nowadays, so it is important that it is recognized.
It is not just based on what a family needs to stay alive, but what a family needs to stay alive and live a decent life. By focusing on the standard of living, people are treated with the dignity they deserve. A focus on monetary resources while taking into account non-discretionary expenses, non-cash government benefits, geography, and the extent of a household are crucial when defining and measuring poverty.
The SPM, however, does not include nonprofit organizations and aid other than government benefits. These should be included because, similar to non-cash government benefits, someone who has access to good non-government benefits is going to have more advantages than someone who doesn't have any access.
Although the SPM is newer, so it's harder to see trends over the years, it is more accurate. It is worth it to use most parts of this measure with less data history since it offers better accuracy.
While the SPM is more comprehensive than the OPM, it doesn't take into account access to education, employment opportunities, or social inclusion. Therefore, these characteristics of defining and measuring poverty should be added to what the SPM already has to offer. These specifics are seen in the capabilities approach.
The capabilities approach is a flexible and multi-purpose theory of well-being that can inform policy decisions through assessment of whether people have the substantial opportunity to achieve certain functions. It doesn't just look at whether someone has the formal freedom to do something or the income to do it. It looks at whether there are other obstacles in the way that may have to do with social inclusion, education, environment, physical well-being, and more.
In evaluating people based on more than just their income, the capabilities approach considers the well-being of individuals on a deeper level. It shifts the focus from means to ends, accounting for the fact that two people with the same sets of goods and resources may be able to achieve very different things depending on their circumstances. For example, everyone in a state may have this formal right to vote, but one individual might have to contend with additional barriers to voting, like voter intimidation, distance to the polls, or a disability that makes it more difficult to move around and complete tasks.
We think that ideas from the capabilities approach should be used in combination with the SPM in order to define and measure poverty because it takes into account factors other than income. Someone whose access to education, social inclusion, and employment opportunities are critical to look at when measuring poverty. All of these things are necessary for someone to be able to live a good life. Someone may have the financial resources to get by, but not be able to do things like go to school or get a job because of social pressures. This framework is useful for creating poverty policy.
In her book, Growing Up Poor, Dorothy Allison says, "You think you have a right to things, a place in the world, and it is so intrinsically a part of you that you cannot imagine people like me, people who seem to live in your world, who don't have it." Living in poverty for most of her life, Allison never felt respected by people who were not in poverty. In fact, society made her feel inferior. This feeling of inferiority due to not having the money to boost yourself out of a bad lifestyle makes a household even worse off because they are unable to get jobs and education due to social pressures and social inclusion issues. This is why social inclusion, educational opportunities, and employment opportunities for those who do not have much money should be taken into account when defining and measuring poverty.
It is extremely difficult, if not close to impossible, to have sufficient capabilities, like being able to access education, get a job, and maintain good health without money. Therefore, like the SPM, income should be a defining part of measuring poverty along with these capabilities.
There are several other poverty measures. 3 of the biggest are the OPM, the official poverty measure, the EXPM, the extreme poverty measure, and the RPM, the relative poverty measure.
The OPM only looks at a household's pre-tax income. The OPM does not include government benefits. These benefits offset some of the costs that are associated with having the basic needs. Government programs like SNAP provide families with a stipend for food, allowing them to spend a portion of their income on other expenses. It also does not look at the differences that are caused by geography. Based on where someone lives, the cost of living can be very different. The cost of living is often higher in big cities than it is in rural areas. While the OPM is easy to track because we can analyze historical data, it ultimately leaves so many key parts out.
The extreme poverty measure, while very useful in drawing attention to those in extreme poverty, isn't very effective for the vast majority of impoverished individuals. It only captures people in the most dire of situations. This counts people out and makes it ineffective in more developed countries where only small minorities live in extreme poverty. Like the OPM, the EXPM is not adjusted based on the geographic area either. Different cities and countries each have different costs and standards of living, meaning a generalized threshold is hard to apply.
The relative poverty measure is measured by looking at who is below 50% of the median income. A person living somewhere where the relative poverty measure is used can have all their needs met and still be considered poor. In an affluent area, the 50% line is going to be high. This means that people may be able to afford everything they need, but still, because there are so many high incomes, they are considered poor. Similarly, in places where the median income is low, someone can be above the 50% line and still be struggling, not being able to meet their basic needs. The RPM is also based on pre-tax income, not taking into account that money is going to be taken out and that it is not the true amount that someone is making.
These measures fail to take into account every aspect of people's lives. The OPM, EXPM, and RPM do not look at people's abilities and access to anything besides money. Looking at income, access to necessities, good education, jobs, and healthcare is a better way to measure poverty because people can be above the monetary threshold but still unable to live a decent life.
Robert Rector, a leading authority of the Heritage Foundation, argues that the average poor person, as defined by the government, has a standard of living far higher than the public imagines. In Rector's analysis of the official poverty measure of the United States, he proposed the ideas that A, the OPM encompassed a vast amount of people that possessed basic amenities and steady access to food, B, that the widespread impressions of people in poverty as homeless and or starving were false, and C, that the media falsely exaggerated aspects of the American poor, which impeded actual efforts to address poverty.
Although Rector makes some valid points, he doesn't take into account that people today have higher standards of living than they did 50 years ago. Air conditioning and washing machines are standard for most people now, not to mention that possession of these amenities doesn't mean that they're in good condition or that the families themselves even bought them.
It is important to look at all kinds of different measures of poverty in order to see what specifics should be looked at in order to define and measure poverty. For accuracy and well-being purposes, which is the main reason to even look at poverty in the first place, aspects of the SPM and the capabilities approach are good ways to understand and measure poverty.
Poverty should be defined as people in households who do not have the means to live a decent, dignified life. For measuring the means at which a person can live a sufficient life are money to buy resources such as food and housing, access to education, healthcare, jobs, and social inclusion. Without a combination of these essential factors, there is no way for someone to be able to live a sufficient life, and therefore they are in poverty.